pressure looks good.
Doubling up. Roger roll, Atlantis.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight outside SC off. Bring in SC off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to NASASpaceflight's live coverage of the Antares Cygnus NG-18 mission from Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia. You're looking at a live view of Pad 0A at Wallops, where Antares is once again getting fueled for another launch attempt. After one scrub yesterday, they're back to try again, launching a resupply mission to the International Space Station. My name is Thomas Burkhart, News Director for NASASpaceflight, and chat is going crazy with the 5x5s, letting us know that you can hear me, so thank you so much for that. We will be offering you updates and coverage of this morning's launch from Virginia with the hopes of getting this Cygnus spacecraft on its way to the station. Also, not going to be just me on commentary. Got a couple other voices to join me this morning. Chris Gebhardt is the Assistant Managing Editor for NASASpaceflight and one of our commentators. Chris, how are you doing?
Doing well this morning, Thomas. How about yourself?
Oh, it's bright and early, but I am here. Actually, it's not even bright yet. It is still
It's
very
not
dark
bright
out,
yet.
but it is early. But looking forward to another launch attempt. And then also we got Sawyer Rosenstein on comms with us today. Sawyer, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, and I can definitely say that yesterday was a reminder to always change your smoke detector batteries when the clock goes back.
Oh no. Yeah, so if you did not see our coverage yesterday or you didn't tune in, there was an actual fire at the Mission Control Center for the Cygnus spacecraft, which is in Dulles, Virginia. That's Northrop's Mission Control Center, and that fire alarm going off before the launch caused a scrub. The vehicle was perfectly healthy, no weather issues or anything. So ideally, we'll get some more cooperation today and one less fire alarm, hopefully. So far, teams are into the countdown. They are tracking towards a liftoff at 5:27 a.m. Eastern Time or 10:27 UTC. We have heard over the nets that the teams are looking at a potential engine issue, so working on that. But the countdown is proceeding, and we'll stand by for any more updates to see if that is a significant issue or not. Weather is reported to be go, so weather appears to be looking good for this morning's launch. So we'll keep an eye on that one potential technical issue that the teams are working. And of course, we'll keep you updated on that throughout the countdown. We will also keep you updated on some answers to your questions. So if you have any questions about today's mission or anything we're talking about, tag us at NASA Spaceflight in chat. And we'll try to answer as many of those as we can throughout the countdown here. But for those who may just be joining our coverage for this mission, maybe didn't tune in yesterday or so, let's start with an overview of the mission. Chris, what is the NG-18 mission all about?
Yes, so the NG-18 mission is all about taking supplies and goodies up to the International Space Station. In all, Cygnus is packed with just over 3,700 kilograms of cargo and experiments for the ISS and its 7-member crew. Cygnus will launch today from Virginia and then rendezvous with the International Space Station in a couple of days. Nicole Mann will reach out with Canaveral and grapple the vehicle and then berth it to Node 1 on the International Space Station, where the crew will then remove the experiments and then load Cygnus also with all of the stuff that is no longer needed aboard the International Space Station and is ready for disposal. Things like dirty clothing, used experiments, things that don't have to be recovered after the mission because the science results are transmitted to the ground. So you don't actually have to get anything back. And Cygnus is really good at being a disposal craft as well. So in all, about 3,700 kilograms of supplies headed to the International Space Station. In terms of the crew stuff, in addition to some of their clothing and personal items from their families, they are also going to be getting some of their holiday stuff as well on this mission. So all about resupplying the International Space Station today. And the Cygnus spacecraft in particular, because Northrop Grumman always honors someone who has been instrumental to the world of spaceflight and space exploration, has chosen to honor NASA astronaut Sally Ride. this time naming the spacecraft after her. Ride was the first American woman in space and flew aboard 2 space shuttle missions before serving on the Presidential Commission investigating the Shuttle Challenger disaster. And then Ride very sadly died about 10 years ago due to pancreatic cancer. But Northrop Grumman choosing to honor her and her legacy today with a spacecraft named in her honor.
Yes, very cool. And I think we'll dive a little bit more into some of those payloads that are on board today's flight in a little bit here. But of course, the focus in the near term is going to be the rocket that needs to get that spacecraft up into space. This is the Antares 230 Plus variant, to be precise. And this is actually the penultimate flight of this particular configuration. Sawyer, talk to us a little bit about why this particular rocket might be going away soon.
Yes, it's very unique situation. This rocket, the first stage especially, is made up of some foreign components. Specifically, stage was designed and is built in Ukraine, as well as the Russian-designed RD-181 engines. So, if you're aware of the war and conflict currently going on between Russia and Ukraine, that is leading to some problems with getting the necessary parts needed to build the Antares in its current form at least. So the plan after this mission and one more Antares launch is that Cygnus, the resupply vehicle, will switch over to a couple of flights on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. And while it's flying on that, they will be working with a company known as Firefly, the company, not the show, to get a newer, upgraded version of the Antares, and that will include American-made parts here, the Firefly base, and new engines as well. So that will be the Antares 330, and that should be expected to fly first on NG-23.
Yeah, and of course, the prompting of all of this, why Antares is moving away from this configuration in the first place, is due to Russian and Ukrainian components on the first stage of the current Antares version. The engines are Russian, and the first stage like structure is actually built in Ukraine. And obviously, there are some current events that are preventing that supply chain from being reliable. And Northrop Grumman moving to an all-American vehicle, partnering with Firefly Aerospace. And it'll also come with a big performance increase. The first stage will be a bit more powerful. It is basically what would have been the first stage of beta for Firefly, which was supposed to be their second launch vehicle. If you've heard of Firefly's Alpha vehicle, that was the first Firefly vehicle to make orbit earlier this year. Beta is a much bigger sort of medium lift design versus the Alpha, which was like a small sat launcher. And they're basically taking the first stage of that, but it's been updated. They've updated the engines that they're going to use. They're called Miranda engines, and some of the sizing has I believe also changed. And they're not calling it beta anymore. They're just calling it a medium launch vehicle, and eventually they'll get a more formal name. But the first stage of that medium launch vehicle will replace the first stage of Antares. You'll still have that solid fueled upper stage, and that's always something unique to point out about Antares is that the upper stage is solid fueled, even though the first stage is liquid kerosene and liquid oxygen. And then eventually they'll also be able to replace that solid upper stage with a liquid upper stage, and that'll just become the full up medium launch vehicle. Also, some room in that evolution for reusability. Firefly intending to make that new first stage propulsively landable. So there is that potential evolution coming up for Antares here in the future as well. But in the meantime, flying out this configuration, and then Cygnus will hitch a ride on a couple Falcon 9s as development of the new rocket continues, just to kind of bridge the gap.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, this will also actually have the same second stage for now as the
Yes.
Antares 330 will, with the Castor 30 XL upper stage, which, unlike most that we're used to seeing, is a solid stage rather than liquid.
Really quick, a big thank you to everyone who supports these streams, and a thank you to Ryan 9000 who became a Red Team member. We greatly appreciate that, and it goes a long way to helping us do what we do. I'm going to start bringing in some questions as we get further into the countdown here. And we got one about the scrub that occurred yesterday and some of the circumstances that led to that. We have one asking, is there a backup control center in case of an issue? I'm assuming such as what happened yesterday. So I'll preface this with a couple different mission control centers, and then Chris, I'm going to throw it to you. There is NASA's Mission Control Center, the ISS control room in Houston, Texas, at the Johnson Space Center. That is mostly just monitoring the launch, but they're not actually controlling anything. They obviously control the ISS side of things more than anything else. Then there is launch control, which is going to be local to Wallops somewhere. I don't remember exactly where, but there's a launch control center where the teams control the rocket. And then the one that was affected by the fire alarm yesterday is Northrop's mission control room for Cygnus. That would be most equivalent to it's like SpaceX's Hawthorne control room to control Dragon missions, and they also control some Falcon 9 from there and stuff. But the mission control room that controls Cygnus after it separates from Antares. So that control room wasn't actually controlling anything yet, unless they were just monitoring Cygnus pre-launch. But obviously, you're not going to launch a rocket and with a spacecraft on board, where the control center for the spacecraft, which is supposed to take over in like 8 minutes or something, is like evacuated from a fire alarm. Obviously, that's a problem. So, Chris, is there like, if for some extraneous circumstances, do they have a backup place that they can control Cygnus from?
They do. At one of their other facilities. It's not ideal, and it's generally in case of well, it's for redundancy and it's for backup, and in reality, it's in case like a hurricane or a major weather event was coming at them while the mission was in space. They could shift personnel around to some of their other facilities outside of the affected area and still continue with the mission, but not when you are in a trying to lift off the ground configuration. It would be the same way when a hurricane is barreling toward Houston, Texas, and Mission Control Houston has to be evacuated. There are backup ISS flight control rooms located in Colorado that would be utilized in the event that Houston got inundated and they had to evacuate, which they have had to do before. And everything, and you can't stop an ongoing mission. But I know at least in the shuttle era, if there were a hurricane threatening Houston, they would not permit the liftoff of the mission. But if it was ongoing during the flight, they would even look at potentially bringing it back early if all of the primary mission objectives had been accomplished. And if not, they would basically go to a skeleton crew and reduce down what some of the crew were doing and some of the support that they had on the mission if they absolutely had to while it was up. But yeah, in general, you don't lift off in a configuration like that when the ground control centers are not ready. But during the mission, there are backup options. Everyone has them, just in case.
Interesting. First of all, we can check off our shuttle reference for the morning, so well done, Chris. But then
Yes.
also, so as far as ISS control, so I would assume that's once Cygnus berths to the ISS, and that is expected about 2 days after launch, that Northrop still has some eyes like helping monitor that spacecraft during operations for the next, month or so. Is that still right?
Oh yeah, because it's still their spacecraft. So just like when the
Right.
Dragons come up and the Starliners come up and dock as well, there's the moments of the flight when the actual control centers have full authority over the mission, right? And then when they enter the 400-meter keep-out sphere around the International Space Station is when a lot of that like really, really, really dedicated coordination and connection with NASA comes in. And NASA can have some options as to what to do with the spacecraft, but it is still a Northrop Grumman, a SpaceX, a Boeing vehicle, not owned by NASA or operated by NASA. In that
Right,
regard.
In
yeah.
fact, all the vehicle manufacturers pretty much have full control over it until you get to essentially a keep out zone around the International Space Station,
Yep.
a kind of imaginary fence that you kind of have to knock on the door before getting permission to go in.
And so there's another question though. So obviously ISS control room in Houston, but obviously NASA is not the only partner that operates the ISS. So like in extraneous circumstances, of course, don't you also have a control room in Europe for the ESA's portion of ISS flight controllers? Obviously Roscosmos has their big mission control center. Like if like NASA control in Houston and they were like not ready to spool up the Colorado center for whatever, like can the ESA and Roscosmos like handle running the station in to fill a gap or something?
Um, that is a really good question. I think the honest answer to that is there would not be it would have to be such a catastrophic situation where
Yeah.
Houston and Colorado were
Okay.
both inundated and affected. And even then, NASA could probably cobble something together at one of its other
Sure.
centers. The manpower is not there at the European control centers because it's mainly Columbus that they're looking at, and some of their other systems, like the ISS Robotics Control Center in Canada, would not be applicable either.
Hmm.
For that, and given the current ground state of affairs, I think any moment of turning over control of one section of the ISS to the other person is not what people would want to be doing right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Although I do believe that backup technically exists between
Yeah,
Russia
okay.
and the US, but
It does. And JAXA also has
executing it
their
would
control
be
center too,
weird.
by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. But of course, from everything that we've heard this morning, the primary mission control centers are all up and running this morning, including the Cygnus control room. So we should be all good. I'm going to dive into our next question, which is from Ron Smith that says, any chances of a jellyfish this morning? I don't know if jellyfish are native to, well, no, I'm kidding. I get the joke. The jellyfish effect that occurs when a rocket launch occurs shortly before sunrise. What is our sunrise time this morning? Let's see. Sunrise is.
Reminder: today's liftoff is at 5:27 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 10:27 UTC.
It is, and sunrise is slated for 6:33, so we're just over an hour
Oh.
before sunrise. That might be too early. We'll wait and
Yeah.
see. Maybe towards the very end of the flight, there's like a little bit. It's probably not. It's not going to be. This is not prime jellyfish effect opportunity, but maybe sometimes you get like a bit of a fainter one, like towards the end of the flight, if it's a little too
Yeah.
early. So we'll
And
see.
Welcome to Edge Case Jellyfish Day.
Edge case jellyfish.
And
There
also,
you
the
go.
vehicle itself might play a factor in that as well, considering you have the two RD-181s and then the solid upper stage.
Yes. Again, please tag us in chat at NASASpaceflight if you've got any questions about our launch coverage here. Trying to think if there's any questions that we got like yesterday too that we didn't get to. I feel like I was thinking of one about people were asking like about the oh, I remember. Is there any reboost by the Cygnus spacecraft planned for this spacecraft's mission while
Ah.
attached to the station? Because the Cygnus spacecraft is capable of helping to reboost the ISS.
Yeah, so this is a good question. Planned? Interesting. I would need to go doubly confirm that, but the answer I normally get from Northrop Grumman ahead of time is Cygnus has the capability to do it. They have demonstrated it now on a couple of past missions. One just a pure demonstration, and one was a let's actually reboost it and give it a little more oomph. But what Northrop Grumman usually says in situations like this is that they have the capability to do it. It's there if NASA requires it, but most of the reboost operations for the ISS are still being conducted by the Progress vehicles and the Zvezda Cirrus module on board the International Space Station, which is sort of designed from the get-go to be the one to do it, with the other vehicles sort of acting as backups if needed. So the Progresses and the Zvezda still do most of it, but Cygnus can. As to whether or not it's planned to do a reboost maneuver on this mission, I don't know off the top of my head. But they can reorient basically the International Space Station to aim Cygnus's engine along the thrusting vector that they wish to fire along, and then they can do it that way.
Yeah, so it sounds like they haven't announced a plan that yes, while this spacecraft is burst, it will do a reboost, but they have that capability and can elect to use it during the mission if they want.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I think Northrop Grumman always says, like, well, it's not planned, but it can happen, is while they're there, if they need to do a debris avoidance maneuver to get out of the way of a piece of debris. They just had to do this a couple of weeks ago to get out of the way of a piece of Russian debris from an anti-satellite test from a couple of years ago. Cygnus would be available to be the vehicle to do that burn if for some reason Zvezda and one of the Progresses that's there couldn't do it, or they didn't want to do it, or Cygnus was more effective in that regard. But moving the ISS into a different orbit does affect your downrange visiting vehicle schedule and your return schedule, because altering the altitude of the ISS does alter the timing of when your ground track comes over a particular area. So sometimes planned reboosts of the station get moved and jostled around in the schedule because they aren't trying to reboost the station for a safety thing. They're trying to set it up for a launch later down the road. So sometimes they can move around. So planning them can be a bit hard sometimes.
There you go. Gotcha. Thank you, Chris. Got another question for you. I'll throw this one to Sawyer, saying while we're talking about ISS reboosts, why is it this satellite, or the station, I guess is the most precise word, have some sort of ion engine for more permanent but lower thrust reboost? So instead of using docked spacecraft, those solar electric propulsion that a lot of satellites use, that the Lunar Gateway will use on the power and propulsion element. And do we know why the ISS was designed for that kind of propulsion?
I don't know exactly why it wasn't designed that way in the beginning, but looking at the technology that was available, because keep in mind, this
Oh,
space station technically started back in the 80s. You're talking as Space Station Freedom before it officially became the International Space Station as we know it today. So a lot of it was kind of that joint cooperation of building the segments together and using the technology at the time and realizing, hey, we have the capability with additional vehicles to boost it and remaneuver it. But Chris, unless you know something else that I didn't there.
I believe the first ion engine flew in space on the Dawn spacecraft in 2007, well after the construction of the International Space Station
Hmm.
modules. Not the ISS was still being constructed then, but the ISS modules were done at that point and had been done for several years. The propulsion elements, like you were saying, Sawyer, the ISS largely stems from Space Station Freedom. And a cobbled together version of Mir 2 from Russia, which were all 80s planned space stations and then actually built and designed in the early 90s. And the ion technology just simply did not really exist back then, like we know it today, like you're asking about it. Yeah.
Right.
Right, and keep in mind how many segments and modules there are on that, and you're talking a vehicle now that from all the way across is the size of an American football field. So it's a massive vehicle too.
Yep, exactly. All right, let's bring in another question here. Ticonderoga asking, is Antares capable of delivering a crew vehicle to the ISS? We haven't seen Antares launch something other than a Cygnus resupply mission before. Has it never been offered for other payloads, and have there ever been talks of a crew launch vehicle?
So Antares has indeed been a rocket that has been on the NASA LSP, on the commercial market, and available for government missions throughout its career. It has not been chosen for any of them. Um, but in terms of Antares' ability to launch crew, I would really want to take a look at the G forces that are imparted by that solid propellant second stage, because it finishes the orbital insertion job in about 2 minutes, which is very fast for a second stage to complete the orbital insertion maneuver, and the velocity change that's required there. So I'd really want to look at that, and is that survivable from a crew standpoint? But the other thing is that Antares maxes out at about, well, right now it maxes out at about 7,500 kilograms of deliverable payload to orbit, which includes the wet mass of Cygnus itself, as well as all of its cargo. And I believe the four-person Dragon capsule is about 10,000 or 11,000 kilograms or 12,000. So I don't believe Antares is really powerful enough to get a crew vehicle into orbit in terms of the crew vehicles we think of today and what we would need, like a four-person rotation flight to the ISS. Could it maybe do a two-person capsule? Maybe, but the mass constraints are going to be really tight. on that. And seeing in our back channel that we
Yeah.
do have a planned hold now coming up at T-minus 11 minutes. We will hold the clock for 5 minutes due to engine priming. This is the issue that Thomas mentioned, that Thomas, you were mentioning earlier in the countdown, where they came in a little bit earlier today and they were looking at unexpected voltage issues on the engines and priming them early. That does affect their recycle time more than they would like, but it is acceptable for today, and it does sound like they will hold at the L-11 minute mark for 5 minutes to complete that engine prime work today.
All right. So
Also,
yeah,
the launch time has adjusted by 1 minute to 10:32:42 UTC. In case anyone wanted
one
the
little
actual to
second
the
of
second
T0.
time. It literally moved from 41 to 42. I love this. The ISS precision targeting. Yes.
There
Yep.
you go.
By the way, just one little minor thing to add, as you pointed out, is that the vehicle is also not currently crew rated, so it would have to go through all of that additional testing and checking and everything that is done to make sure that any vehicle can safely support crew.
Yeah.
And one thing that I really love and why I wanted to point out that too the second time is because the opening of the window is at 5:27:41. So when we say a 5-minute window, well, it's a 5 minute and 1 second window today, technically. So you always take that with a little grain of salt in the seconds, one way or the other, when we talk about ISS rendezvous and rendezvousing with any vehicle in orbit, because that to the second time really does matter, because 1 second later and you're outside of the plane of what Cygnus can correct for to get you back to the ISS 1 second earlier than window open, and you're also outside of rocket performance as well. So that second really, really does matter to these missions.
There you go. All right, so we will count down to that new T0. You got that countdown timer in the top left updated to the new T0. So now just about 20 minutes away from that potential liftoff time. Hopefully the engine priming can be completed in that amount of time and we can move on into liftoff. Keep you updated on that. No other issues being worked, either technical or weather or anything like that, or range issues, nothing else reported, just the working on engine priming procedures. And hopefully that 5-minute hold will be enough time to wrap that up. But yeah, okay, so moving back into so just to recap our discussion of basically what else Antares can launch, especially the crew vehicle.
Oh,
And
yes.
Antares is actually the same kind of, I guess, weight class maybe as Soyuz is. Soyuz is probably the lightest crew capsule that goes to the ISS, or crew spacecraft, and Antares is right in that same kind of vein. In fact, also when Rocket Lab announced their Neutron rocket, everyone noticed that it was basically that exact same payload class that they were targeting, and due to various design changes, the numbers will fluctuate a bit during development. But so yeah, like you said, they'd obviously have to look at the solid upper stage. That's something that hasn't been used on a crew vehicle before, and they'd have to look at what exactly the crew vehicle would look like, because Dragon or Starliner are both heavier.
Yeah.
Because they do make use of heavier lift launch vehicles such as Falcon and Atlas, but
Well, and NASA also mandated some sizing requirements for Dragon
mhm.
and Starliner specifically to avoid the cramped Soyuz conditions for the ISS and that we learned on ISS flights too, which is another little interesting part of that, right, Thomas?
Right, yeah, absolutely. So all of those things considered, it would depend on what the requirements for the vehicle would be, and go from there. Also worth mentioning that Antares is going to be upgraded. So in the future, the vehicle might be more capable, and that capability might kind of make itself there. But in the meantime, I don't think there's been any near-term plans anyway. I do want to provide another update during the countdown. I mentioned earlier that there was no range issues being worked. We had just gotten an update that the range has gone red, potentially due to a boat in the range. So the range is now red. That is a new issue now being worked through the countdown. We will keep you updated and see if they can clear that violation. There's plenty of time, about 17 and a half minutes, before T0, but it looks like there is a range violation currently taking place.
So what I love about this is range violations are not the norm down in Florida, although there have been a couple of very high profile ones in the last year. But they're not the norm. Most of them do not incur range violations that end the mission like that. But I always love that. Like Vandenberg and the Cape seem to every once in a while it happens, but launching from Wallops just seems to be like a gauntlet race, where everything possible is thrown at you because boaters and other mariners and aircraft operators are just not used to range exclusions out of this range, and that is not an excuse. I do not offer that as an excuse. You should if you're a boater or aviator, you should always know where your exclusion zones are. But what we see at Wallops is just the general public not being used to these things. As they are down here, and down here you leave Port Canaveral, and my gosh, you absolutely have to check where your exclusion zones are because it's very easy to violate it if you just go straight out, for example. So
even if it's not a launch day, even there are lots of other restrictions around the Space Force Station too.
Yeah, and that just don't exist up here. Not an excuse, but in case anyone's wondering, why does it seem like Wallops always kind of has issues like this? When you only launch twice a year orbital like that, people just aren't used to it.
Hashtag read the NOTAM.
Read the NOTAM, yeah.
The NOTMAR. This one will be the NOTMAR.
The NOTMAR, yeah.
Yes. Well, NOTAM too, yeah.
But yes, also read the NOTAMs. Very good point. Yeah. But yeah, so just to recap, teams have pushed the T0 by about 5 minutes. That was for the engine priming issue that they were working at. Hopefully that gives them enough time to resolve that. And then it sounds like the boat that has entered the range now and fouled the range had an engine failure. And so they drifted into the range and are now violating the NOTMAR. So that's an interesting problem. We'll see how they resolve that. As long as they can. So this is how this works. There's an area where boats cannot be in at liftoff, basically, and during the ascent. If they can proceed with the countdown, if they know that the violation will be cleared by T0, basically, they can proceed with the count, and that is relying on the local law enforcement, Coast Guard usually, directly communicating with the boater and even being out there with them potentially and saying, yes, they will be out of the way by the time you launch. It's all part of an evaluation of basically what the chances of any harm being done to either the mission or more frequently to the boaters themselves in the event of something going wrong. And so the teams and the local law enforcement and the range can all evaluate whether there's any significant risk before continuing with the T0. And it is very much a case-by-case basis. So they'll look at that boat that is kind of stranded right now, and if they can get them somewhere where they are confident that they are safe in the event of a launch anomaly, they will be able to tell the teams that they are clear to proceed. And the countdown will, of course, proceed in the meantime anyway. Clearly, it's not a security issue if the boat has entered the range because of its own engine failure or something. So they'll work on that, and they'll be communicating, and we'll keep you up to date as to whether or not that's going to cause any issues for liftoff.
And there's one other thing that I would add to what you said, Thomas, because I know it's how the Eastern Range works down here in Florida, is the exclusion zones are usually bigger than the true danger zone on purpose, right? Because you want to keep people X number of extra kilometers away from all of that. So sometimes what can happen, and this does happen more often than not in Florida, is you can actually technically have a boat or an aircraft that's technically still violating the range keep out zones, but they are outside of that immediate danger zone within the NOTAM or the NOTMAR, so you can waive the requirement and you can lift off even if there's a boat or an aircraft in the range because they're outside that danger zone, and everything.
So another minor update.
Okay, we can mention this. Oh my gosh.
This interesting. It might play into the actual decision. The boat that is stuck in the range is actually a range boat. Like, it is a boat operated by the launch range. It's not a random boat that is drifted in. It is literally a boat enforcing the range that it has now violated. So that's fine.
That's honestly better, and I don't mean that as a
Yeah.
joke, because that means the range wasn't actually violated by someone not paying attention. That's
That
good.
is true.
Yes.
Correct.
So a boat that was likely enforcing the keep out area has drifted into the keep out area when its engine failed, basically.
And if you think back to Falcon 9 launches, right, you can see those boats that we're talking about, right, like going back and forth on the ocean. When you watch launches from Florida, so you can see that sometimes they do get very close to the launch pad. So this will probably just come down to where in the range is it
Mhm.
disabled? Yes.
Yeah, because there are certain exceptions in the past, at least for the Eastern Range, where they have certain boats that they know are out there that they will specifically monitor, even though they'll, technically be in that right on the edge of that area. But as long as they know who they are and where they are, they exception.
And Range has decided that they are green for the launch, so the stuck boat will not interfere.
Yes, so it sounds like that issue has been cleared. Range is back green, which is good. We're coming up on the 11-minute mark. The teams had been in technically a hold for the last 5 minutes to delay the T0 for an engine priming issue, but that countdown should be resuming, and our clock on the top left will be resyncing with the actual clock that the mission controllers would be seeing, and we'll keep you updated on whether or not they have resolved that issue completely, but hopefully that gave them enough time. Should be coming out of the hold right now and back into the countdown, 11 minutes and counting. So I believe it is time for just a couple more questions as we get towards the business end of this countdown. Again, liftoff now targeted for 5:32 a.m. Eastern Time, 10:32 UTC. Another question here. Trent asks, will the ISS be expanded in the next few years? I believe there might be some plans for that, right, Sawyer? Oh, wait, hold on. Really quick, before you answer that question, should say that they did finish the pre-launch poll, and they are go for launch. So they did get that issue resolved. So all on track.
Yay!
But Sawyer, you first. ISS expansion, I believe that's coming, right?
Right. There have been some private modules that have been added already on board the ISS, including the inflatable beam module, and Russia just added their newest module, Nauka. But yes, there are more plans for more commercial missions to the International Space Station from companies like Axiom, and with potential for them to add on to the orbiting laboratory, and then when the ISS's time is up, they can then detach that and create their own space station out of it.
In other words, no gap in space station coverage in low Earth orbit. They finally learned the lesson about
Well,
transitioning programs. Well, and I'll say that because we've still got 7 years for them to make this true.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
And at the
I'm
very
going to
least,
hold
they're
off on
making
that
an
until I
attempt at
actually
no
see it.
gap.
Yeah,
Yes.
they have planned no gap. I'm not entirely convinced, but we will see.
Yeah, and
Um,
just a reminder of that continuous nature too. There has been a continuous human presence in space since I believe November of 1998. So yeah, keeping that going.
we will see. But regardless, yes, I'm definitely excited for the Axiom modules and stuff, and some other commercial space stations as well, which is cool. But anyway, under 9 minutes to go now, and yeah, everything on track for liftoff now. They have worked through that engine issue. Um, and then the range has been cleared and the range is green now. Weather appears to be cooperating as well. So all items appearing on track for an on-time liftoff.
And I would actually like to.
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh yeah, I'd actually like to talk about the liftoff really quick. If there wasn't another
Yep.
quick question you had there,
Nope. All
Thomas.
you go for it.
Perfect. All right. So Antares operates a little bit differently from other rockets that we are very much used to seeing, and that really has to do with its solid propellant upper stage. Because the rocket still has to insert Cygnus into, I believe it's roughly a 375 by 185 kilometer orbit. Swap those numbers around because perigee normally comes first. So 180 by 375 kilometers. And it has to hit within a few kilometers of that perigee and apogee range. And how do you do that with a solid propellant upper stage that cannot shut down when the orbital parameters are more or less reached, right? But just has to keep burning and everything until it's fully done. So The way Antares does this is the first stage of the vehicle fires for about 3 minutes 30 seconds in the ascent. It does not throttle its engines down. They've actually beefed
Oh
up the
yeah.
second stage so it does not throttle down through max Q. It just punches full force until tail off and engine shutdown. And then there is about a 1 minute long coast between first stage shutdown and second stage ignition. And during that coast, a couple of things happen. One, the first stage separates, the payload fairings deploy, and Cygnus attached to its second stage, Castor 30 XL upper stage, is released. And then the computer inside the Castor 30 XL is going, okay, what's the energy state my first stage left me at? What is my altitude? What are my coordinates? What's my position? What is my orbital target? And what is my energy state within the second stage? And it uses all of that together in closed loop guidance to lock on to a flight path solution to fly to orbit so that it wastes the excess energy that it has in the stage to account for a potential first stage underperformance. So the second stage can still counter for a first stage underperformance, even though it's a solid stage. And it's that added extra performance that they now need to scrub off, but they have to burn it. So the way the stage calculates its trajectory, and you'll hear a call out, right? Guidance converged. And that means that the stage has locked onto its solution of how it's going to fly itself into its proper orbit. And it does a series of S-curve maneuvers to bleed off the excess energy. But because it has to hit a very precise orbital plane, it can't S-curve side to side. It has to S-curve up and down within the actual trajectory and within the prograde vector. It has to pitch up and down. And that pitch up and down is what actually wastes the excess energy to allow the stage to burn out within the orbital parameters needed, which is close to 185 by 375 today. And in fact, the perigee is usually a little bit higher than that, which helps a little bit. But that is how the solid propellant second stage actually does a precise orbital insertion, is by S-curving inside the plane.
And
And
Chris, oh no, go ahead, Thomas.
I was going to say, Chris, you did actually a deep dive interview with Northrop Grumman, basically
Yes.
all about this topic, and it's one of my favorite articles you've ever done. I'm going to go ahead and link that in chat a couple times. That is a full interview with the NASA Spaceflight folks about how those solid upper stages do all of those things, and it's a super cool read. Highly recommend reading that article after seeing this launch because it is very cool.
Yeah. And of
But
course,
anyway, go ahead, sir.
my brain was probably going same place as Chris might have gone for another vehicle that also used S curves to bleed off excess energy, aka mark your bingo cards, the shuttle.
But in the reverse, right, where she could
Correct.
S-curve out of plane coming home. But yeah,
Not
it's
on
fascinating.
Liftoff,
And yeah, check out that article because it is absolutely fascinating how solid second stages do this. Yeah.
And Antares is not alone in that. Antares is probably the most common one, but there are Minotaur rockets. I'm trying to think, any other all solid? Even like because the last stage of Vega is still liquid.
The last stage of Vega is liquid. The Japanese Epsilon rockets, are they all solid?
No.
And Kueizhou
wait, hold
and the
on.
Kueizhous are all solid, right? From China?
Oh, geez, now I'm second guessing myself. Hold on, JAXA Epsilon.
I don't think it's the only. I don't think Minotaur and Antares are the only solid stages that actually insert the payload into orbit. I
Epsilon
think
has
there
an
are two
optional
others. Yeah.
liquid stage.
Yeah.
And then what was it? Kueizhou is definitely a good guess. Let's
And
see.
while you're looking that up, by the way, just an update: the range remains green.
Excellent. As we are 3 minutes 20 seconds away from the launch of the Antares rocket with the NG-18 mission up to the International Space Station with the SS Sally Ride Cygnus vehicle packed with 3,700 kilograms of crew supplies and cargo for the ISS. Of note, when Antares lights its engine and lifts off with that first stage, it performs what is called the Baumgartner maneuver. So it actually cants the engines, swivels the engines just a little bit to perform it basically does a bit of a pitch and a power slide away from the launch pad to protect some of the pad infrastructure there during liftoff. and ensure proper clearances. So if the rocket doesn't look totally vertical at liftoff, don't panic. That's intentional for Antares.
Yep, definitely. And to wrap up our solid discussion, Guizhou has one liquid stage at the end. So there's
There we go.
there are definitely a lot of rockets that use solids initially, and then the liquid kind of fine tunes the orbit. But there are a couple to say that they are all solid, and the solid does that orbital insertion. So
And
plugging that article for sure.
yes, and at 2 minutes 10 seconds, just a quick note: if you are in the Carolinas, Virginia, Delaware, New York, portions of the southern northeast, Philadelphia, West Virginia, if the skies are clear, go outside and look. You have the possibility of seeing this as it heads southeast from Wallops Island, Virginia. But that is highly dependent on the cloud cover. So I hope the viewing is in your favor.
So there we go. So everything appears on track, coming up on the 90-second mark. All on track for a liftoff here. This is again the Northrop Grumman Antares rocket, the penultimate Antares 230 series rocket that will be launching Cygnus NG-18 to the International Space Station. A cargo resupply mission should be on a 2-day rendezvous profile to berth with the ISS with the assistance of Canaveral. And after resolving an engine issue on the first stage, as well as a range violation, all have been cleared and everything is good to go here from Wallops Island in Virginia.
And listen for that guttural sound as the RD-181s ignite. It's a neat sound that has its days numbered, both for Antares and the other RD-180 that we use here on the Atlas V. So enjoy the sound of the engine start in 45 seconds.
Oh,
And when they hit T0, the engine, that's when the engine sequence starts. So there will be a bit of a delay between the clock hitting 0 and you actually seeing ignition. So don't freak out, it's not an abort. It takes a couple seconds for you to actually see it based on just how exactly they time the countdown. So under 30 seconds to go, let's watch as the RD-181 engines ignite for today's mission. "15 seconds. 10 seconds.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
There's stage 1 ignition. And liftoff! Liftoff of the Antares rocket from Wallops, Virginia on the Cygnus NG-18 mission.
Gorgeous sound of that RD-181s igniting there, and Antares lifting off successfully from pad 0A at Wallops Island, now 1 minute and 35 seconds into the flight. Things continuing to go well aboard Antares' first stage, thrusting at 100% of rated performance. You can see the cloud cover there getting some of the tracking cameras here, but real-time live animation now based on the telemetry coming back from the rocket here.
And there's an interesting bit of telemetry you can see on the top right. You can see one of the acceleration plots there has a bit of a vibration there. That's actually kind of interesting.
Oh yeah.
I would presume that there's some combination of sensor vibration and actual rocket vibration being shown in that telemetry, but still, rockets are a little bit vibratey on the way up.
And we should be coming up shortly on the end of this first stage, which burns typically for about 2.5 minutes.
Yes. But yeah, again, this is live telemetry. Everything appears on track so far.
You can actually see like the pitch profile of the vehicle versus the prograde vector. That's pitched a little bit higher than the prograde vector there. At the nose, you can see the yellow line, the prograde vector, and the red line being the actual flight path. So pitched a little bit up above the prograde vector, which we would expect.
That sound on liftoff was awesome too.
Oh my gosh, that guttural groan of the RD-180. The RD-180 series. That's why I love it. Yes.
I'm gonna miss those engines.
All right, and we are coming up here now very shortly on the staging between the two vehicles here, usually about 3.5 minutes to that
3-minute mark.
And you can see on the acceleration plot, they plateaued. Do they throttle the first stage near the end for G-limiting?
I do believe they do throttle it.
Because that's what you're seeing there. That's why the acceleration has that downstep. And there you see MECO.
So that is the end of closed loop guidance, where the rocket was just following a pitch versus time sequence. We have had first stage separation, payload fairing separation coming up next. Guidance is now trying to lock on to that solution for the second stage to get it into its proper orbital altitude. You can see some of the
we're getting indications of the thrusters firing. Those are what those blue cones are.
And we see the payload fairings separating here.
There we go.
And we see okay, there we go.
Yeah, there's the shroud that encompasses the upper stage.
Perfect.
Yep.
And there we go with the ignition, and it has locked on, and now you can see our perigee and apogee indicators are in kilometers. Good, thank you for putting everything back into the metric system. It was imperial during first stage for some reason, and it really threw my brain off. But now we can see, but now we can definitely see that we're increasing that now.
Chris, I have a question. We saw that stage do a big pitch maneuver there. Was that expected?
That looked weird. I'm not gonna lie, but
it may have just been an animation
thing.
It could just be the camera swinging around in their virtual world. But
I mean, I've never seen that on the animation before, and it usually is locked. It usually is locked into real-time animation. So let's see what we get to. I mean, none of the callouts. It could have been correction. It could have been the stage actually like realizing I need to burn a little bit differently. Let's see where we get in our.
We'll listen in the callouts. Like there have definitely been times where the animation has been a bit off, so we'll wait and see.
Well, there was one time where like the first stage just never separated on the animation.
Oh right.
Yeah. Or the payload fairings never separated on the animation, but and this mission did have improved guidance and trajectory planning. So this let's not jump to a conclusion.
Yeah, exactly.
It righted itself. Let's see where we get to on perigee and apogee. None of the callouts that we're hearing from the folks in our back channel are indicating something amiss.
Yes.
So let's just go, because remember what I said, it's all about the second stage figuring out how to do the burn profile. So let's see where we get with this.
And the fact that is said that the guidance has converged at least, so that's also a good sign, right?
Yeah.
Also, I see someone in chat saying that the second stage is pulling 16 Gs. No, the units on that acceleration plot are meters per second squared. So 16 meters per second squared is like 1.5 Gs. It is not pulling 16 Gs, I can assure you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, perigee is raising here. Let's see where we get. Perigee's at 11, is at 1,000 kilometers negative now, about to go positive.
Yep.
Again, we're aiming for a
out
185 by 375-ish. So
ish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, an ish, because it's a solid rocket, so that's ish. But we're orbital now, and there goes the perigee. There goes the apogee.
That is certainly a stable orbit. So
that That looks about right.
That looks about right.
Yeah,
Okay,
That
and a
that
burnout
links within
nominal call out.
family, yeah, and a
Yeah.
nominal burnout call. Let me check. Let me make sure I didn't get the apogee wrong there in my head for what they were targeting.
You are getting, I mean, you can see it actually still rises a bit, and that's another thing you have to deal with a solid upper stage. You'll have some residual thrust as the last bits of propellant kind of burn.
Yep.
And that's
So
why
now
it's
the
not
apogee's up to
They
305.
were targeting. Oh no, they hit it perfectly. They were targeting 168 by 313. They hit it.
Oh yeah,
That's
so yeah,
that's
that
a
is well
perfect orbit
within
insertion for
acceptable. Yeah.
Cygnus. Yeah.
All right, so
Um,
that was either just an interesting animation, or they did a, that was actually part of the planned burn that I calculated. But either way, definitely a nominal ascent because that live telemetry is very consistent with the planned, the planned insertion.
I mean,
And it looks
honestly,
like
for a solid rocket vehicle, that's a
Yeah.
dead-on accurate insertion. Yeah.
I say this a little often, but anyone who's tried to do this incurable knows it is very difficult.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
looks like they just
orbital.
rotated the upper stage, by the way, to get Cygnus into the proper orientation for separation.
Yep, and orbital velocity targets at 1.75 meters or 1.5 kilometers per second looks good. That's about what,
Yep.
or 7.5 is what we would expect. Yeah, that all looks nominal to me. So
Yep.
that whatever that was either an animation thing or the stage really did flip itself around to fire a retrograde for a couple of seconds, realizing the overspeed and how much extra energy it was given. Yeah. I know the question I'll be asking Northrop Grumman later today.
Yeah, we'll do a follow-up for sure.
Yep.
But regardless, it has resulted in a nominal ascent and a launch here, just standing by for spacecraft separation, which will be delayed a little bit. Not
Yeah.
delayed from planned, but delayed to allow, again, that residual thrust to finish burning off on the solid upper stage. And then I think you actually touched on,
Yep,
well,
there we
right
go.
on cue, there you go.
There we go.
And actually, what the second stage will now do, and you can see it doing
Yep.
it now. It now will basically swivel itself left to right, burning because it's using those aft thrusters to pulse itself away from Cygnus, but it doesn't have forward-facing thrusters, so they have to basically do this little like swivel dance with the second stage behind Cygnus to get the proper clearances at stage separation.
There we go. So there's a nominal ascent for the SS Sally Ride on its way to the International Space Station. Antares done its job, and Cygnus now ready to take over for about a 2-day trip to the ISS. And now there's that animation we all know and love. Always after spacecraft step, the upper stage starts going crazy. I wonder if that's just the telemetry starts shutting down or something.
After stage
that we've
separation.
seen
Oh
like
no,
every
because
single.
because as the thrusters are firing, it is changing constantly.
Well, a
and
little
that's
bit.
why. Yeah, because
Yeah.
if you noticed, right at separation, they switched, and you had the live telemetry coming back from the stage, and you had this is where we left Cygnus.
Yep.
Mhm.
All right, but that concludes a nominal ascent for Antares and Cygnus. There is our favorite launch time view, the empty launch pad, which we didn't get
Yes.
yesterday, but we get it today, so that's good. So launch pad 0A now empty and ready to go for another launch in the hopefully not too distant future. Wallops set to host another Antares early next year, and also potentially a Rocket Lab Electron coming up here before the end of the year.
But you can
But either
actually see
way,
that launch pad in the view right now.
yeah,
back
just
right
off to the
there.
right there. But I believe that is also our cue to start wrapping up our launch coverage after a nominal liftoff and ascent. Want to go around the horn and thank everyone for tuning in and thank everyone for supporting the stream. We also had Chris Gebhardt on comms. So Chris Gebhardt, thanks so much for hopping on.
My pleasure, Thomas.
And Sawyer Rosenstein, thanks for hopping on comms as well.
Thank you for having me back this early in the morning. Appreciate it.
If you are looking for another way to support the NASA Spaceflight stream, we thank all the super chats and thank you so much for even just tuning in and asking questions and things like that. But if you're looking for another way, we also have the NASASpaceflight.com store, so do want to offer that as another great way to help support our coverage. The 2023 calendars are some of the best, the newest merch available now. So you get 2 different calendars, one for our Starbase coverage and one for our broader spaceflight coverage. So, and I believe you get a discount if you buy them both. So that's a great way to help us keep doing what we do. Also, lots of new metal prints and shirts and everything always being added to the store. So thank you everyone who supports us that way. We really do appreciate it.
And then you can use that calendar to mark off the dates for the next Antares, the final one for 230, and Firefly, and all of those coming up.
All right. But yeah, I also want to give a thank you to the production team, both Michael Baylor and Kevin operating today's stream, so appreciated that. And then a huge thank you to our friend Pat for rolling out and operating that camera you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Pat, thank you so much for rolling out 2 early mornings in a row to provide that camera view. Much appreciated. But that is going to do it for our live coverage. So for NASA Spaceflight, this is Thomas Burkhardt. Thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned for future spaceflight coverage both here on the YouTube channel and over at NASASpaceflight.com. And that will sign us off for now. Thank you all so much for watching.
We have liftoff. Propulsion continues to be normal.
Chamber pressure looks good. Toggling up. Rock and roll, planet.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight ST off. Bring in ST off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.